Hello, PZ, you there?
Hello there. Hi.
Hi, welcome to Blogging Heads TV.
Yeah, it's a new thing to me. We'll see how it goes.
So, I'm John Horgan. I've been doing Science Saturday for a few months now with George Johnson, but we have been trying to bring in guests, real scientists, as well as other science journalists. And so that's why I wanted you to come on the show, invited you on. So thanks for coming, and I wonder if you could start by telling the audience who you are.
Sure, although, you really brought me on because you're getting tired of George, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Shh, not supposed to tell anybody.
Okay. Yes, my name is PZ Myers, and I am a developmental biologist. I work at the University of Minnesota Morris, which is the small liberal arts campus of the University of Minnesota, located way out on the western prairies of the state. Kinds of things I do zebrafish development, I do teratology, I do a few other things in the lab.
Teratology, I got to stop you. What's teratology?
Oh, making monsters. Real
Cool.
mad scientist stuff. Yeah, so using chemical agents and so forth that disrupt development in interesting ways, and so you mess up the development of the embryos, and then you try and puzzle out exactly what you have done, to the cells and tissues with your particular agent.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I just have to ask you, how do you find time to do any research or teaching or anything other than blogging, since you are one of the most prolific bloggers on the web?
I have two secrets. One is complete disinhibition. Just anything that comes through your mind, poof, drop it onto the web. So that really helps in bringing up the volume, although it may not help with the quality. And the other secret is you've got to move to a little tiny town of 5,000 people where there's next to nothing else to do.
Do you have kids? Do you have a family? Because that's another time sink.
Yes, I have 3 kids, but they are of an age where they are almost no trouble at all. 2 of them have moved out and they're at college and living on their own, and the third one is a very independent young lady who doesn't want my help in anything, so it makes it much easier.
So tell us about your blog. I mean, the first time I heard of you was a couple of years ago when Nature ran a story. I actually have it right here. I'll hold it up to the camera. Top 5 science blogs, and the #1 blog, in fact, it was ranked 179th overall among the, whatever it is, 60 or 70 million blogs around the world, is, okay, and here's where the trouble begins, because I don't know how to pronounce this. Pharyngula? Is that how you pronounce it?
Pharyngula.
Pharyngula. Okay.
Yes. Yes.
And what is it? Start by telling us what is Pharyngula. What does that term mean?
Well, have you heard of a blastula?
Yes,
and
I've heard of it.
Uh-huh.
Goes way
Yes.
back to my high school biology classes.
Right. So those are all stages in early development, and those have been around for a long time. People have named them in the 19th century. Pharyngula is a recent coinage by Bill Ballard, who named a particular stage in development after that. Then that's the stage when you've got the Hox genes being expressed, when all kinds of interesting whole body patterns are forming, when the basic body plan is laid out. So it's a stage with a lot of development and evolutionary significance.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also very obscure and confuses people, which is a good thing to have when you title a blog. Something abstract and
yeah.
But yeah, that Nature article is a lot of people have mentioned that Nature article, but the thing is, they're saying best science blog, top science blog, whatever, but it's purely on the basis of traffic.
Mm-hmm.
And
well, that's a pretty important basis.
that's an important thing, but that's not necessarily relevant to the science. And I think there's a lot of really good science blogs out there that don't have as much traffic as I do because they don't talk about sex as much.
Sex. Sex is the secret to your success.
That's one thing, Talk about sex. Talk about squid. Talk about and talk about like I mentioned, the disinhibition thing. Just open your mouth and fire away. That draws in traffic, but it doesn't necessarily make you the best science blog. So I've got to put that disclaimer out there. I don't have pretensions along those lines.
Well, you're very modest, but let's go back to the sex for a second and explain what kind of sex that you're writing about. So this is not human sex primarily. You are into sex between creatures with long, slimy tentacles. Is that right?
Or chitin, or good things like that. Yeah, there's the in the world of internet porn, invertebrates are poorly represented, and that's my job here is talk about what spiders do and what squid do and what all these other creatures are doing.
Why? What is it? So you have this fascination with cephalopods. Is that how you pronounce the term?
Yes.
Cephalopods in general. So cephalopods include squid,
octopus, cuttlefish. Yeah.
Where did that come from?
Well, it's there's actually a serious reason behind it. I do not do research on squid. People think I do, but I do not do a single thing with squid. What I work with is zebrafish, which is a classic model system. It's a very boring sort of tropical fish. It's perfectly ordinary, and the advantages of zebrafish are that it's simple and that we think it's representative and all that kind of thing. And you've got to have some perspective sometimes. And so I got into this habit when I was working with my zebrafish and reading about the zebrafish in the literature and writing stuff about zebrafish to sort of reach out and say, okay, I can't get into this mindset where fish are all there is, and I've got to have something to stabilize me where I reach out and I say, okay, here's this other organism. I'm going, every time I read a zebrafish paper, I'm going to go look up this other creature and see what's written about it. And cephalopods are just kind of cool. So, yeah, I said, okay, let's dig into those. And the more you get into them, of course, the more fascinating they are.
Well, that seems to be true. I don't know if you how much you've seen George Johnson and me talking in the past, but I've mentioned on a few of our chats that my wife is a wild bird rehabilitator.
Yes.
And so we're, in fact, if people listen carefully, they can hear some crows screaming in the background because my office is right next to my wife's 400 square foot flight cage, and there happen to be 5 crows. There's one screaming right now. 5 crows back there. And what is astonishing and in a funny way sort of disturbing is that when you are in close quarters with these animals, a crow, it's just this sort of black bird. There are lots of them. They make noise. But then when you get to know them up close and personal, you realize that each one has its own distinct personality, and they just have all these complexities of character, and they're so much more intelligent than you could ever imagine when you're just seeing them from afar. And I guess that's true. I've done a little bit of reading about cephalopods, squid and octopus primarily, and I guess the same is true. The more people study these creatures, the more they realize how complicated they are and how they even have their own distinct personalities.
Oh, yeah. I think there's a lot of creatures that are like that. I mean, the zebrafish are the same way.
Zebrafish?
Yes, I spend a lot of time staring into the tank, and pretty soon you begin to recognize individual fish, and you begin to recognize personalities.
Yeah.
And, like right now in my tanks, I know that there's one tank where I have this big, aggressive female. She's a very territorial little bitch who will not allow anyone near her except when it's mating time.
Yeah.
And then you find, you can look in there and you see all these little males who are kind of sucking up to her and wanting to get close to her. And then there are these other females that are doing their own behaviors. But you can sort of sort out this sort of social organization in the school. It's kind of cool. And I think lots of animals do that. Cephalopods do it. Maybe insects don't. But
maybe we haven't looked carefully enough.
That's right. What you have to do is you have to sit there and you just have to do that good old, natural historian observational stuff where you sit there and you watch the animals for a long time, seeing what they're doing, and then you suddenly start to see patterns emerging, and people just don't seem to have as much tolerance for sitting there and watching insects scuttle around.
If anybody would know that whether insects have distinct personalities, it would be Edward Wilson, the great
Right.
Harvard biologist. He just visited my school last spring, and damn, I didn't ask him that. Can you tell the difference between Larry and Harry the ant, and one is extroverted or one is introverted? The science. I don't know how regularly you read, or if you ever read the Science Times and the New York Times, which comes out every Tuesday. But
Yes.
One of my favorite writers is Carl Zimmer. In fact, he's another blogger on
Yes, he
Seed,
is.
along with you. And he's done, I think, a few pieces now on distinct animal personalities. So, how flamingos, you've got one flamingo that is, instead of, I guess scientists had thought that there was kind of just one generic personality for a particular species. But again, as you said, the closer they look, the more they realize there are these individual differences, which I suppose, as in the case with humans, are determined both by genes and upbringing, environmental circumstances.
Right. Yeah. And fish, we suspect it's the same way that you can have a fairly simple set of parameters that influence behavior. So things we look at in the lab are things like aggression, caution. There's also some interesting social behaviors, whether you like to be with other fish or whether you want to be independent. And you just take a few of those parameters and you combine them together and get all these combinatorial differences. And you start seeing that you have a lot of different potential ways that animals can interact with one another. What
about I know you've written a lot about, or your research, I guess, bears on this new field called Evo Devo, and I gather George and I have tried to touch on that in at least one past episode, because I gather that is really shaking up the sort of simplistic model of how genes create an organism. And so I wonder if you can, you're right in the middle of it. George and I are both gross amateurs trying to figure out what's going on from the outside. But could you just tell us, what's going on in Evo Devo right now, and why it's really important to understanding nature, nurture, and all that sort of stuff?
Sure, but I have to clear something up. My pal Larry Moran at the University of Toronto has written a few complaints about this, that some Evo Devo people are claiming, these grandiose things where they're going to solve everything, they're going to revolutionize evolutionary biology, and for instance, things like gene regulation, they've been around for a long, long time,
right.
The 1950s, and so. In one sense, no, they're not doing anything that's really revolutionary in that sense. Bacteria have gene regulation, so okay, so I'll say that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for being so careful and cautious and not indulging in the kind of hype that certainly we science journalists indulge in all the time. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, but now I get to hype.
Yeah. Okay. Now go ahead. Hype away. You put in the caveat.
Yeah. At the same time, though, what we're doing is we're introducing a new perspective, where what we're saying is, what you got to do. What's really important when you look at an organism, and what's really influencing development in particular, is the interactions between genes. You have to kind of imagine an ecology of gene networks, that what's going on in the animal during development, and also during basic physiology, the behavior and things like that, is that you're seeing interesting patterns of genes communicating with one another. So what we're interested in is these interactions. We want to know how genes are affecting other genes and so forth. Like I said, it's not an innovation in the sense that we've known about this since the 1950s. But what it is a difference in emphasis.
Right.
It's also something that I think is going to be of increasing importance because of the Human Genome Project, and the other genome projects. These various genome projects have produced this huge amount of data, and you look at it and you say, okay, here's a string of DNA, and here's this obscure enzyme, and then here's this little transcription factor, and then here's this cytoskeletal protein. They're all lined up on there, and you realize this doesn't tell you anything at all about the organism.
Yeah.
Right? It's important information. You can use it for comparing different genomes and so forth. You can use it to search for candidate genes that might be involved in particular processes. But when you ask the question, okay, how do you take this string of DNA and turn it into a human being, there are no answers in the genome itself.
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
What does this imply for... I've been trying to figure out what this means for genetic engineering. So, over the past 15 or 20 years, we've heard all this talk about designer babies and how we're going to identify single mutations that, or single variants of genes that underpin high intelligence or an extroverted personality or that are related to particular disorders. And so the hope is that by these relatively simple manipulations of genes, we can redesign ourselves so that we have fewer flaws and we are more and more perfect in every possible way, physically and mentally. So does Evo Devo, is that going to make it easier to do this kind of engineering in the future, or does it mean that those sorts of predictions are incredibly naive?
Well, it's both, of course, because what it's saying is everyone's got this really naive perspective on what's going on with the genome. And Evo Devo is saying it's much, much more complicated than you ever imagine. It's a really hard problem, and just having a sequence doesn't tell you all this information.
Yeah.
The hopes for things like genetic engineering are right now they're focused on simple things where you can say, okay, here's an effect of a single gene. For instance, if you want to modify your baby's eye color, you can find a pigment and you can change the pattern expression of the pigment gene.
Yeah.
So you got a tight focus on something you can do. Or if you're trying to correct a genetic defect where you know that there's a mutation in a particular gene, you can go in and fix that. But think for a minute, something like the shape of a baby's nose. That's not simply encoded in the genome. There's not some gene that says, okay, you are going to have a bulbous nose or you're going to have a thin nose. What there are is a whole collection of genes, things that affect patterns of cell migration in the craniofacial area, for instance, genes that affect cell adhesion, genes that are going to affect local neighborhoods, are going to affect the size of a field that's going to be set aside for nasal tissue, whatever. Mm-hmm. It's a whole bunch of complicated things that are working together. And there's not one thing you can go in and tweak and say, okay, now you will have Paris Hilton's nose.
Right.
At the same time, what it's also saying is that, for instance, if it's a gene for cell adhesion, for instance, that determines the proportion of cells that are going to end up in the nose, that gene is going to affect lots of other processes.
Mm-hmm.
Going in and adjusting it so you get Paris Hilton's nose may mean you end up with a receding chin. Who knows? We don't know. That pleiotropy is the rule of the game.
What was the term you just used?
Pleiotropy, where one gene has many effects in the organism.
So what does this also mean for the nature-nurture debate? You periodically get people on one side or another. I mean, from the very beginning, I think, who was it? I think it was Spencer who coined the term nature-nurture in the 19th century, and as soon as he coined it, he said it's over. Basically, we know that nature is much more important than nurture, and of course then that just began the debate. And we've had periodic announcements ever since, usually from the gene side of things, that the debate really finally is over. So that was sort of a theme of Steven Pinker's book, The Blank Slate, which came out a few years ago. Steven Pinker, of course, is the evolutionary psychologist at Harvard. But I would think what you're saying is that an implication of Evo Devo is also that nature, nurture is just, we're uncovering more and more layers of complexity as to how we are created, how our bodies are created, how our minds and personalities are created.
Right.
So
well, it's deeper than that, though. I mean, the analogy I like to use for this particular problem is, back in the 17th and 18th centuries, biologists were very concerned with one big issue, which is, the generation of the fetus. And they said, okay, there was a group of biologists who said, well, it's all done by the sperm, and the sperm carry all the information, or the sperm contain the embryo, and that gets into the female, and she just nurtures it. And there were a few who said, no, it's all in the egg. They actually had names for these. There were spermists and there were ovists. And there was this huge battle going on over which agent was the most important.
Mm-hmm.
And of course the answer is both are absolutely essential.
Sure.
Both are providing important information. And the whole argument is just silly. That's the nature and nurture debate right now. Is you got people saying, oh, it's nature. You got people saying it's nurture. And I say, no, you can't do anything without both.
Right. But you still have, even once, I guess everybody agrees on that now, but then you're still left with the question of which is more important when you're talking about a specific trait. So another thing I've been bringing up in some past Blogging Heads chats with George Johnson is aggression and warfare. So I'm working on an article now on whether war is inevitable, whether war is in some sense in our genes. So how constrained are we in our attempts to get past this sort of social aggression that has afflicted us from prehistory, possibly going back to our common ancestor with chimpanzees. And there are some people who are very pessimistic and say that our nature is such, aggression and including social aggression, are so deeply ingrained in our nature that we'll always be dealing with war or the threat of war in some sense. I like to be optimistic and think that we're smart and decent enough, or just cowardly enough, to get past war once and for all. But that's an area where nature, nurture is still really playing out.
Right, but again, I would refer you to my analogy. Which is more important, the sperm or the egg? And it's just not a question that's relevant.
Yeah.
It's an interaction between the both.
Right.
And I would say the same thing with nature and nurture, that there are going to be strong genetic elements that influence our behavior, but they're never quite as straightforward as some of the people want you to think. I mean, I do not think that there is, for instance, a gene that says, oh, well, you like to go to war. There's nothing quite that simple in there.
Right.
What there will be is genes that encourage social behavior, that encourage liking to be around people, liking to form communities. There will be genes that influence levels of aggression
or conformity. I think a lot of warfare can be explained just by simple conformity. If you live in a warlike society that is pushing you towards these certain types of behavior, then you're just going to go along to get along.
Oh, exactly. So what we have are these general substrates of behavior that are then shaped in particular directions by the culture that we're raised in. So it doesn't matter if there is a gene that makes you more aggressive. If your culture says, okay, channel that aggression into creating great works of art or building buildings or whatever, that I'm also very optimistic that we can reshape culture despite these strong genetic impulses that carry us. The genetic impulses don't say specific things that we must do. They say general properties of behavior that we then use culture and education and parental influences and social influences to steer in particular directions.
Oh my God, we're both such bleeding heart liberals. I hope we can find something to disagree on before this conversation is over. There's one other biological issue I wanted to bring up. I've been going back and looking at some of your recent blog entries, and you've got a few that refer to a book called Life Code by Stuart Pevar.
Oh.
And what interested me about this was that it seemed as though the theme of this book is similar to that of books by people like Stuart Kaufman. He used to be at the Santa Fe Institute. I think he's moved on. Also a guy named Brian Goodwin, a British biologist who used to be associated with the Santa Fe Institute. So these are people who have sort of challenged the explanatory power of the new synthesis of evolution plus genetics to explain biological diversity,
yes.
And they're trying to come up with some sorts of principles of self-organization. The terminology sometimes shifts from scientist to scientist, but I think it's sort of the same thing that Pevar and Kaufman and Goodwin, and there are plenty of others who go back even to the beginning of the century, have talked about. So I wonder if you can,
yes.
And I guess you've looked on this somewhat critically, so maybe you could tell us what.
Well, I've looked on Pevar's work critically, but in all those reviews, practically the first thing I feel compelled to say is that I really like these structuralist ideas. That's what we're talking about here, is that there are processes in chemistry and physics that have a deep influence on what cells can do, and this has been around for a long time. Darcy Wentworth Thompson and his book On Growth and Form really pushed this idea.
When was that published? That was, what, early 20th century?
Yes. Yes, and for instance, in his book, Thompson looks at a field of cells in the microscope, and he says, those look just like what would happen if you had a bunch of soap bubbles. They would all pack in the same way. And he's saying, you can't say, well, there is a genetic determinant that says cells will be round. There isn't. What makes cells round is that's a least energy form when you've got a vesicle, when you've got a lipid membrane and so forth, and when you've got cells packed together, they assume particular form. So he's making a legitimate argument. Brian Goodwin also is doing the same thing. He's saying, when you look at a lot of things, what you find are very detailed, very specific morphologies, and you can't say that that's encoded in the genome. What's going on here is that there's all kinds of interesting interactions between genes and cytoplasm and the environment. All three are important to produce this particular form.
Yeah.
So Pevar is tapping into a legitimate and very interesting tradition in developmental biology. Of course, where he goes wrong is that unlike Thompson, who was a great observer and actually looked at organisms, Pevar has gone off on his own little tangent, and it looks like he's trained as an artist, and he's a pretty good artist.
Mm-hmm.
And he's let his imagination take over, and he's sort of built all these elaborate rationalizations for here's how this particular structure in an organism developed and evolved. And you look at it and it has absolutely no relationship to what you can see when you look at an embryo.
Uh-huh.
So, for instance, he's got this this model of how you form digits, and he's got these diagrams where he's got the digits like this. I'm holding up my hands right here with the fingertips together, and he says, okay, well, you got these tubes, and they stretch and they attenuate, and that's how come you get fingertips that are smaller than the base of the finger and so forth. And it's total nonsense. That's not how limbs develop, and it's not how limbs evolve. Limbs evolved as protrusions from the body wall, and they do not meet at the midline. They develop independently. So you see little things like that, and while I'm sympathetic to the structuralist program. And I think that's a pretty cool thing to be studying. The way you have to study it is like Brian Goodwin does, and that is you get a microscope and you look at embryos and you try and puzzle out what they're doing.
Well, what's fascinated me about this is I had in my first book, The End of Science, I had a section devoted to Stuart Kaufman's work in self-organization. Mm-hmm. It sounds like it does have something in common with PVARs. And what fascinated me about Kaufman's work, and again, he was sort of in this same realm that Darcy Thompson and some others had already been writing in, was that it seemed to arise out of some deep dissatisfaction with evolution as an explanation for life, and the sense that we needed something else, some other big principle to really explain the incredible diversity of organisms and all their forms. And the way that Kaufman put, Ilya Prigogine, also the Nobel Prize winner, I think he's sort of in the same general area. And it's almost as though they're looking for something. The way that Kaufman put it was a kind of anti-entropy force, a self-organizing principle that could counter the drift toward disorder and the increase in entropy that's sort of decreed by the second law of thermodynamics.
Yes.
But it's always, these theories are always sort of marginalized. So Kaufman got a lot of attention back in the late 80s and early 90s. So did Brian Goodwin. There was all this interest in complexity and principles of complexity, and then it just kind of died away. I guess there are a few parts of the theory that were just sort of incorporated into the mainstream of biological thinking, but really it was just sort of pushed aside.
Yes.
So why? I just bring that up because to me, I'm fascinated by the idea that maybe there could be this great revolution in the future in biology where evolution is really challenged in some serious way.
Well, I don't think it's going to challenge evolution, but it's going to provide other principles. I mean, first let's qualify it though. Things don't defy the second law of thermodynamics, so it's not really an entropy-defying principle, but it's just another principle for generating complex form. And yes, it's kind of faded a little bit, and I think there's a really good reason for that, and that is that Evo Devo has been so darn successful.
Yeah.
The time when Kaufman was on the wane, his 80s, 90s, and so forth. Back in the 80s, he was really popular. Is also the time when Evo Devo started to provide all these detailed explanations.
I see.
And one of the things we're discovering is this is a theme I wrote about a while back, is that there is this tradition of things like Darcy Wentworth Thompson, Stuart Kaufman, etc., and developmental biology, providing these beautiful models, these simple schemes where you can use a few principles and generate some astonishing complexity out of it. And everyone was really attracted to these models. They're beautiful. They do amazing things. But then when people started, humping in there and breaking genes and looking at what's going on there, what we find is that, for instance, flies are the extreme example. We find that all these, for instance, these repeating patterns of segments, they're hard-coded. It's this incredible kludge where it's just kind of hammered together, and each little segment is independently specified by its interactions with genes in neighboring cells. It's not some beautiful rhythmic reaction diffusion mechanism or anything elegant like that. It's barbaric. It's bad. It's horrible. So everybody's saying, yeah, it's biology. And so there's been this trend away from the simple solutions, just saying, it's a digital code, and evolution is this really crappy programmer who just sort of cobbles things together, and you end up with these incredibly complex, elaborate schemes that don't fit the elegant designs that were out there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So Evo Devo is providing some of the answers that these self-organization theories.
Yes.
Sort of.
Although I got to qualify that. For instance, flies are these highly derived organisms. they've been evolving intensely in complicated ways. So it's kind of unfair to compare those to something like a Precambrian animal. And it's quite possible that these kinds of simple rules, physical, chemical laws that were the basis for a lot of organismal form. That what you do is you have something that sets up a rhythmic pattern and that defines the segments in the ancestral bilaterian. And then what's happened in evolution is that that little bits have been added on to make it more robust, more reliable, and those little bits have grown in importance until you've got all these special cases built into the system that are really essential for defining it.
Yeah. Well, that's... thanks for that update. I must admit, I find Evo Devo pretty difficult to follow, but I think you've allowed me to have the illusion that I understand it a little bit now.
Yeah, I've got that same illusion.
Hey, listen, I wanted to segue to another topic. I think Blogging Heads listeners, watchers, to this point, they might think you're, this very smart, well-informed biologist who is...
And now you're going to change their perspective on that? Oh, come on.
But there's this other side of you, and so I'm going to to make the segue to this other dimension of your writing by asking you this simple question. PZ, why do you hate religious people so much?
I don't hate religious people. I hate God.
Okay, that's interesting. You said, are you saying that God exists?
No, I'm not. I'm making a joke. This is one of the hard things about the blog is that I do have strong opinions, but I also tend to make jokes of a lot of things, and people get very upset.
Jokes are good. Some things deserve to be mocked, including ourselves.
Right. Yeah, and that's how I feel about it too. I don't hate religious people.
You must hate some religious people.
I hate. Well, hate is even a strong word.
Well, that's true.
Yeah.
What about George Bush? You just feel sorry for him?
Again, hate's this terrible word that would say, well, if I saw him, I would kick him in the crotch. And no, I wouldn't. But I do despise him, and I think he's been a disaster for the country and things like that. So I hate what he has done to the presidency. Let's put it that way.
Well, so just back up a little bit and say how you grew up in a Christian family. Is that right?
A moderate Christian family. We went to church most Sundays, and I went to Sunday school regularly, and it was never a fire and brimstone sort of church. It was
Protestant or Catholic?
Yeah, I was brought up a Lutheran.
Uh-huh.
And it was in a very strongly Scandinavian area of Washington State. So it was that sort of Scandinavians don't get passionate about much of anything. So you went to church and you had your coffee afterwards and you chatted with everybody and everybody's happy and nobody's bad, and it's a pleasant social kind of religion. Mm-hmm. So I grew up with that.
Mm-hmm.
And actually even now I have absolutely no problems with that kind of religion. I think that's fine if people want to get together and form communities and do good works and all that sort of thing. But this whole idea that we have to believe in the supernatural being, no, I'm not so much into that.
When did you have some sort of epiphany when you were a teenager, or was there a single event, or did you just sort of gradually?
It was gradual. What happened is, when I hit 14 or so, you go through your confirmation classes, which is instruction in what your particular religion believes, and it's a prerequisite to be able to take communion and so forth. Is that you have to go through and you have to learn all the doctrine. And so I'm sitting there in these classes, and they're telling me all these amazing things that I'm supposed to believe, and slowly realizing I don't believe any of that. And then with no fanfare and with no ill will, I just decided this wasn't for me, and I left the church.
And at that point, had you already become interested in science? So you sort of saw science as a way of explaining some of these mysteries that religion pretended to explain?
Yes, and I'd been interested in science since I was a teeny tiny little kid. Practically, my first memory is my mother showing me how to use a toy microscope, for instance.
Wow.
And my grandmother used to save all my pictures. I would do my little childish scribbles, and I would draw animals, and it turns out that every time I drew an animal, I had to draw this little cloud of something around his head, and I explained that's his brain. So, I was always interested in this sort of thing. What's going on inside the organism? So, yeah, I grew up believing that there is a way to learn about things. And the way you learn about things is you actually take the thing and you look at it and you try and figure out what it's doing, and you read about experiments and you do science and good things like that. And religion became increasingly uncomfortable for me because it's antithetical to that. You do not do that sort of thing. The way you learn things in religion is somebody tells you it's so and explains to you, oh, here's all these learned scholars who've gone over it for centuries and they've come up with this answer, and all too often the answers were really weird and didn't bear much relationship to reality at all.
At what point, when you started a Pharyngula, did I get that right this time? Pharyngula?
Close enough.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which was, what, 4 years ago?
About 4 years ago.
Did you want to write about, because you write a lot about intelligent design and creationism and the various idiocies of religious people, their sort of pseudo-science. Did you create the blog intending to take that on? Because obviously that's something that I think it's fair to say takes up a majority of your posts.
Correct. Well, not exactly. I mean, I've been doing that kind of thing on Usenet since about 1993. I was very active in the Talk Origins group.
Wow.
So, that's been a continued, I call it a hobby and some people call it an obsession, but either way it works. And when I started the blog, it was with no specific intent. It was like I said, here I am in this small town, and it's really hard to communicate with people except this small community here at the university. And so I said, I could play with writing, and I could put things on the web, and I could see if anybody else is interested in reading them. And so the blog has always been a hodgepodge of, here's what I'm doing for dinner tonight, and here's this stuff I really hate that I found on this newspaper, and here's some cool science that I read about. So it just kind of congealed in that sort of sense.
Well, I must say, I love your blog. I think you are just you've got just the perfect writing style and temperament for blogging. You just have this incredible talent for invective. I mean, I think of myself as being pretty good at invective as well. But I have a lot to learn by reading somebody like you. I just love the way you coin.
So you're saying I'm a big meanie head? Yeah, okay.
But it's
perfect for blogging.
Well, there's this. Fortunately, you have it's all good humored, even when you're obviously really mad. In fact, mad scientist. That's a term that somebody's used to describe you. I just downloaded this article. I'm holding it up in front of my screen now.
Oh, the City Paper article, yeah.
The mad scientist, that I think is a wonderful profile of you. Did you like that piece?
No, that was a guy named Mike Mosdale, who's a writer for the City Paper.
Did you like it? I know you didn't write it.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, it's very... but you never know. People, I write about scientists all the time. Sometimes I think I've written something incredibly flattering, and the subject can find something to disagree with. But I have to tell you, this piece, as you said, the writer is Mike Mosdale, and this appeared in it's sort of the Village Voice of Minneapolis.
Yeah, it's one of those weekly, entertainment weekly sort of things, where they talk about events and entertainment, and they always have a nice, solid, substantial article. A lot of these weeklies have done a much better job than the daily newspapers at actually digging into things and writing stories with substance, and that's kind of their tradition.
Well, this guy, Mike Mosdale, happens to be, I know him. He's my sister-in-law's brother. So my brother is married to a woman named Laura Mosdale, and her brother is Mike Mosdale. So small world.
There are only a few hundred people living on this planet, and everything else is alive, right?
Right. By the way, I have to. I'm just going to show something to the Blogging Heads audience now. I'm wearing a T-shirt, sort of for this special occasion. While I'm talking to the noted firebrand mad scientist P.Z. Myers, it says this is a T-shirt. I wrote a piece a few years ago for the New York Times on the war between scientists and religious believers, and I said that if you're a non-believer, you're feeling a little bit beleaguered as George Bush wins the second presidency, and it just seems like the religious fanatics are dominating discourse around the world, and so I wrote this piece, and then I got a T-shirt sent to me in the mail by Andy Rooney, the 60 Minutes commentator.
Huh.
I'll just read it. It says, it's got a picture of the Bible, and it says, Holy Bible warning may impair judgment. So I'm showing this to the screen right now. So,
yes.
So I've done my fair share of religion bashing, but I'm mild-mannered compared to you, PZ.
Oh, come on now. This is the same problem that Richard Dawkins has got. Is we can say, we can just say simple things, and all of a sudden we're just inundated with complaints that we're hostile and vicious and mean. And I haven't breathed fire once yet. So
well, let me ask you about that. It seems that I've written, I have great admiration for Richard Dawkins. I think he's courageous. I think he's a brilliant writer, and I think he's basically right in everything he says. But I must admit that his tone bothers me, and I worry about the problem of. I mean, he's obviously not converting anybody to his point of view. He's sort of rallying.
Oh, I think he's actually had some successes.
Really?
I've talked to a few people who. But he's not converting devout Christians. He's converting people who've been sitting on the fence for a long time.
Yeah. So you think there are people who might read The Blind Watchmaker or read The God Delusion who are sort of, let's say, maybe an impressionable teenager, and they go, God, that's right. Boy, this religion stuff really is a bunch of crap.
I don't know any, but I could imagine that. The thing is that what he's doing is that he is saying things very bluntly, and he's not doing the thing that most critics of religion have done, which is to say, I don't believe in God, but okay, it's all right if you do, and I can understand why you might believe in. Instead, what he's saying is, I don't believe in God, and I don't understand why anyone would believe in that pack of nonsense.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing to have out there. There's always been this deference to religion that he is challenging, and he's saying, whether you agree with him or not, what he's saying is it's time to start looking at it critically.
Yeah.
And that's what we need, and that's what gets people upset, is there are a lot of people who feel that it is not allowed to examine cherished beliefs with a critical eye, that there are also people who identify so strongly with their religious beliefs that they feel that any criticism of, the Trinity or whatever weird thing they believe is a direct assault on their identity as human beings.
Well, let me just ask you, I think one of the implications of Dawkins' writing, and also some of the things that you've said on your blog is that religious people have to be either ignorant or stupid to believe in the biblical account of life. And I'm sure you know people. I know many people. What's puzzling to me about this whole religion-science divide is that I know brilliant people, highly educated people, PhDs in biology. I met this guy. You've heard of Simon Conway Morris,
Yes.
the great British evolutionary biologist. I met him when I was at one of these Templeton Foundation gigs in England a couple of years ago. And Morris he's a very good, at least as far as I can tell, evolutionary biologist. Has done a lot of really good work on analysis of the fossil record and so forth. But he is a devout Christian who believes in the resurrection of Christ and believes that Christ performed miracles. And I can't, he is not stupid or ignorant by a long shot. I think this is what, in terms of the direction of his rhetoric, Dawkins misses, and I wonder, and I guess I'd put this to you too. It seems to me that sometimes you miss this. It's this really puzzling question. How can people like this hold what to me are completely incoherent, inconsistent, contradictory views of reality? This whole religion question seems really deep. I mean, do genes explain this? Why we can, there's some kind of strange compartmentalization going on.
Right.
I did a Q&A for National Geographic with Francis Collins, the director of the Human Genome Project. He's not just a Christian. He's not like one of your sort of milquetoast Lutherans, the ones you were describing. He's an evangelical Christian who, again, believes that Christ was this supernatural figure. He thinks that there is a supernatural moral order to the universe, but he is, very intelligent, very articulate, and obviously knows biology inside out.
Yes.
I can't figure this out.
Well, I got to qualify this a little bit, that I don't think these people are stupid, and I don't think that Richard Dawkins thinks they're stupid. That stupid is a word I tend to avoid using in reference to these people. But words like ignorant and so forth, they're perfectly appropriate. They're ignorant of some things. I'm ignorant of many things myself. If I had to fix my car, I think it'd be fair for a mechanic to say, "Gee, you're awfully ignorant," because I wouldn't know a thing to do. And it's the same way here, that we all have our little domains of expertise, our own little biases and prejudices, and some of them we can be brilliant in, and I agree. People like Simon Conway Morris, absolutely brilliant as a paleontologist. I love his work, the science work. And at the same time, we can have these blind spots where we're just nuts. That's true for all of us. The thing is, the argument that we have with religion is that religion is a social institution that encourages the development of a major blind spot in people's brains. And, Conway Morris, Francis Collins, smart guys, but they've been thoroughly indoctrinated by this deeply founded cultural institution that says you have to believe in this particular belief. That also has some things that are kind of appealing. They promise you eternal life and so forth, and maybe Christianity doesn't do it, but other religions promise virgins and so forth in paradise. Those all appeal to people. They also address issues that people are afraid of. We all have loved ones who have died, and it hurts. And here's something that's making an empty promise, but it's still a promise that these people you cared about are happy and going on with an afterlife. And those kinds of beliefs are compelling.
Do you think that, where do you think we're headed with religion? Do you think that inevitably religion, at least these sort of traditional forms of religion that involve an afterlife and supernatural figures, miracles, all that sort of stuff that you associate at least with evangelical Christianity, but also obviously with Islam and Hinduism. I mean, all of them have sort of some supernatural elements. Do you think all that eventually will fade away, that this is just sort of one last efflorescence of religion in the face of the encroachment of science?
Yes and no. Of course it could go any way. I would think, if terrible things happen, if the economy collapses, if war breaks out, major wars, I think there will be a greater resurgence of religion. That when people are happy and content, then they can afford to dispense with the solace of religion, and so that kind of thing could influence any prediction you might want to make. What I would think would happen, what I would hope would happen, is that religion will never go away because there are people propagating it all the time, and it's got some pretty ferocious approaches to it, but that it will wither in importance. When a while back I wrote something where I said my ideal would be for religion to become something like Civil War reenactment. It's a hobby. It's something that most of us don't really get into and we can't quite comprehend. But it's fine for people to do this, and in some ways it can be channeled into interesting things. Civil War reenactors, they know a lot of history. They do a lot of studying of the past, and they know these things. That's great. And religion could be the same way. So that's kind of what I hope would happen.
Well, let me just add a alternative point of view to what you said about instability leading to a resurgence of religious belief. It seems to me that it's not just religions that people grasp when times are tough. It's a total ideology of any kind. So if you look at what happened in Russia at the time of the revolution, Russia, obviously a poor, unstable country, and it was seized by the meme of Marxism.
Yes.
And Nazi Germany after World War I was seized by the meme of Nazi ideology, which I think have something in common with religion, in that they present this sort of total worldview. It can be, in the case of Nazis, it would be reassuring because it says that the Nazis are the chosen people in a certain sense of the Aryans. So that's what worries me, and that's what bothers me about some of the claims that Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Dan Dennett and some of the sort of new crop of atheist writers have been making is that it's ideology of any kind that worries me. An ideology that says, here's this way of thinking about the world. Here is a set of values. This is the absolute best perspective that you can have on human existence. And you should embrace this. And if you don't, you're in trouble. You might even be killed. Because we don't want anybody who's questioning the system. That's part of what all these systems demand is total acceptance.
Yes, no, and I agree that what religion is really good for is fostering tribalism, for getting communities to lock together and perceive an enemy. And I do not consider atheism to be this great virtuous tool. It's just common sense, and it would be easy to pervert it and say, okay, well, we're going to separate the country into the smart secularists and the evil religious, and we're going to have a civil war, and that would be just awful. That's not what we want.
See, sorry, go ahead.
Well, anyway, so I'm just saying that At this point, what we are is at a very early stage where people like Dawkins are basically just saying it's okay to be an atheist. Here's these strong ideas we have about religion and how we disagree with it. What they haven't done, though, is put together any kind of package that says, okay, here's the new tribe.
Right.
If you look at atheists,
they've tried with the Brights, and
which everybody ended up laughing at.
Yeah, with good reason. I think when atheists get all together and start sort of slapping each other on the back and all agreeing that religious people are a bunch of idiots, and I've been at some of those parties myself, but they get really obnoxious.
Yeah.
They're at their worst when they're all in this sort of self-congratulatory, smug mood.
Well, yeah, but we got reasons to be smug because we're smarter than everyone. No.
There you go. See, you just can't help it, can you? See?
That's right. But yeah, okay. But on at the same time, what you find is there are all these different groups. I mean, in Minneapolis alone, we have like 4 different groups. We've got the secular humanists, and we've got the Minnesota atheists, and we got group called Atheists for Human Rights, and we got the campus atheists, skeptics, and humanists. All these different groups, and
do they all disagree with each other on which one is the best?
Oh, a few. There's a few little disagreements, but in general, no. It's just we have our own way, and we're going our way.
Right.
Atheism seems to be fostering the opposite of tribalism. It says it's fostering a lot of independence and a lot of disparate groups. If it acquired some ideology, then I agree you'd have to worry. I mean, just like communism and atheism got coupled, and then all of a sudden there were these groups of atheists who had this really deeply established ideology that they were going to fight for. Then it got ugly.
Well, this Times op-ed piece that I mentioned earlier, where the one that inspired Andy Rooney to send me this T-shirt that I'm wearing. The point that I made in that, I was asking whether I should join a group like the Brights or the secular humanists, and I said I felt that the whole problem was not sort of religious ideology or political ideology. It was that this need to form groups of like-minded people who share our values. To me, the way that you sort of decide to make a meaningful life for yourself is totally personal and idiosyncratic, and it's the last thing I would want to do is form a group of people who shared my values. So actually, at the end of this piece, said that I'm going to form that each of us should have our own completely individual religion or ideology or whatever. And I called mine Horganism, and I said it's mine. You can make fun of it, you can loathe it, you can admire it from afar, but you can't join it.
Uh-huh. Well, I won't send in my membership form then.
No, but I did say I would accept donations.
Yeah.
And I'm happy. No, I won't even go there. But let me just make one more point about sort of science versus religion. One of the unfortunate aspects of this whole sort of culture war between science and religion now is that it's, sort of religion is turned into this monolithic entity, and science is turned into this monolithic entity. So scientists are all the guys in the white lab coats who are, smart and well-informed and reasonable and, good people. As a science,
all true. Yeah.
As a science journalist, I feel it's my job to point out that within what's sort of accepted as science, there is a lot of irrationality. There is, in extreme cases, there is even fraud, but there's all sorts of bad science that is being peddled by scientists and science journalists. And I actually sort of feel like people who are into young Earth creationism and astrology and ghosts and stuff like that are so far beyond the pale. I can't be bothered with them. Because science is so powerful and has so much credibility, I feel it's more important for me as a journalist to try to root out hype and exaggeration made in the name of science,
Yeah.
whether it's psychopharmacology, which is telling us that antidepressants will cure every ill that we have, or evolutionary psychology, which says that Darwin can explain every little quirk in our nature, or even something as esoteric as superstring theory, or this theory that purports to tell us how the universe was created and why it has this particular form. And I guess I worry that if you look at the history of the 20th century, Marxism and Nazism were both supposedly based on science. They have this kind of pseudoscientific sheen to them, and so I'm still worried about. Obviously, I'm tremendously worried about religion nowadays, religious extremism. I mean, the headlines of any paper tell you how dangerous it is. But I'm also worried about a resurgence of belief in some cockamamie pseudoscientific theory of human nature that forms the basis of a brave new world.
Right, like intelligent design. I mean, that's what they are, is a pseudoscientific thing. Yeah, I mean, that I can see your concerns that there are many things where we're on the edge of discovery, where there's room right now for lots of divergent opinions. Even things like global warming and string theory. You've got well-informed, educated people who are becoming increasingly out there on the fringe, but they're getting a lot of attention, and they've got some legitimate arguments to make. Some,
yeah,
at least some. And you don't want to get into this situation where dissent is locked out.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, when we look at religion, what do we see? We see these incredibly effective social organizations. They are really good at getting things done. That's one of the strengths of religion, and it's one of the weaknesses of things like science and atheism, where we do not form these groups. So I kind of mixed feelings about this. I do not want, I do not want this to be the Atheist States of America or something silly like that. But on the other hand, I disagree with you a little bit that I think some organization is a good thing.
Yeah. Well, especially when you've got a religious dope in the White House who has,
yes,
incredible power at his disposal. I'm just hoping
right.
that I guess I believe in being a bleeding heart liberal. I believe that we can correct our mistakes. We'll throw these bums out, and we'll get somebody who's got to be better because they can't be any worse.
That's the hope, but at the same time, there's this hard kernel of people who work together to get dopes like that in there. And when you look at the other side, what do we find? We find this scattered mob of individuals who are all chattering away in their own particular direction, and we don't get that kind of unity behind particular candidates or particular causes that we see from the religious side. And I agree completely that we don't want to turn this into the war between the secularists and the religious. But on the other hand, we also have to have some level of organization where we at least work together to make sure that our views are represented in Congress and so forth. And it's a hard line to draw.
Well, listen, PZ, I think that was a very that was very eloquently said, and I just realized we're already we're running up to an hour and 10 minutes. Time flies when you're having fun.
It's not my fault. You keep talking.
Yeah. So all I can say is that I'm glad you're on my side, and in spite of our differences, we agree on a lot more than we disagree on. And keep flaming the bad guys. You're doing a great
That's
job.
my role in life, yes.
and also you're highly entertaining, so you're doing good work, and also it's just good, clean fun. So I urge I hope you get a lot of new readers from this appearance on Blogging Heads TV, and I'll keep checking in regularly, and maybe we can have you back at some time in the future,
sure.
Especially as the election heats up and the stakes and the final battle is joined between the godless and the believers.
I've been talking less and less about politics on the blog over the years, but I can just see it coming as the election gets closer. It's going to turn into one of those flaming liberal blogs again.
That's okay. Somebody's got to do it.
That's right.
So anyway, PC, thanks a lot. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's been fun. Let's do it again.
Okay. All right. Talk to you later.
Talk to you later.